There is a famous video of the capture of Slovyansk police station by Girkin people. They're all wearing masks, and there is a city mayor who is standing next to them on the barricades, and she's just telling the locals, don't worry, these are our guys. She has no idea who is behind the masks, but she makes this assumption.
What the Kremlin ended up doing was taking advantage of that lack of clarity. And it was by taking advantage of that confusion, that kind of, well, they're protesters, we're not sure, shouldn't use violence against them. Gosh, do we really want regular army forces to be going after civilians in towns? Not sure that's a good idea. Unfortunately, the Kremlin is not constrained by such niceties when it decides what it's going to do.
Welcome to the Irregular Warfare Podcast. I'm your host, Alexandra Chinchilla. Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. But the war began 8 years earlier, when a small number of Russian agents and local militants helped turn political unrest in the Donbas into an armed insurgency. Why did these militants succeed in some cities but fail in others? And what does this tell us more generally about subversion, resistance, and state resilience? To answer these questions, I'm joined by Dr. Celeste Wallander, who served as the former Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs under the Biden administration, which was a position where she played a leading role in coordinating the response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. She previously served as Senior Director for Russia and Central Asia on the National Security Council from 2013 through 2017, which is right as the war began, and she was Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Russia, Ukraine, and Eurasia from 2009 to 2012. I'm also joined by Dr. Serhiy Kudelia, who is a professor of political science at Baylor University and author of the book Seize the City, Undo the State, The Inception of Russia's War on Ukraine, based on extensive fieldwork across eastern Ukraine. In this episode, we discuss how Russian operatives exploited ambiguity and local networks, why Ukraine proved far more resilient in 2022, and what the United States could have done differently in 2014. The Irregular Warfare Podcast is a joint production of the Empirical Studies of Conflict Project at Princeton University and the Modern War Institute at West Point, dedicated to bridging the gap between scholars and practitioners to support the community of irregular warfare professionals. You can find more resources on our website at www.irregularwarfare.org. Support for this episode of the Irregular Warfare Podcast comes from Hadean, an AI company focused on synthetic environments for training, planning, and decision support. Without further ado, here is today's conversation. Our first guest is Dr. Celeste Wallander. Welcome to the show.
Great. Thanks so much, Alex. Great to be here.
Our next guest is Dr. Serhiy Kudelia. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for inviting me, Alexandra.
So today we'll be talking about the lead up to Russia's war in Ukraine. Russia shocked much of the world when it launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine on February 24th, 2022. But the war actually began 8 years earlier with the annexation of Crimea and the outbreak of armed conflict in the Donbas. So Celeste, you were working on the National Security Council at this point. What was your perspective on how the conflict was developing?
So I think probably something that a lot of listeners wouldn't necessarily put this in the frame, but I think it's really important, especially given Serhiy's great research, which is we had just gone through a period in which we'd had protests in Kyiv and other towns across Ukraine, but especially the Maidan protest. And the United States and Europe and much of the international community had supported the rights of those citizens of Ukraine to protest against the Yanukovych government because Yanukovych had basically rode to his presidency promising to bring Ukraine into the EU. And then under Russian pressure in the fall of 2013, he reneged on that promise. And that's really what brought protesters out to call the leadership to account for reneging on its promise. And this follows on a tradition within Ukraine of protest against corrupt leaders or leaders who are not, following what they had been elected to achieve. And in particular, of course, the Orange Revolution is a predecessor to this. So from an American and a Western position, a European position, when word came out of protesters coming out and complaining about Kyiv's policies, complaining about the fact that there was a new leadership that hadn't been elected. There was a moment or a context in which you couldn't necessarily come out and say, well, these protests are illegitimate, that we denounce these, because we'd just, adopted a policy criticizing the Yanukovych government first for, reneging on its promises and then using violence against those protests in January and then February of 2014. And so there was a hesitancy to criticize the protests and a call to calm down, negotiation, conversation. And there wasn't an immediate American or European stand on the side of Kyiv against the protests. There was actually, if you go back and look, there was an extraordinary variety of views of toughness about the Kyiv leadership, toughness about violence or building taking. And it was into this confusion and this murk, this lack of clarity, that the Russian influence that Serhiy begins, is able to show wasn't there necessarily evenly. And I thought it did a masterful job of showing that. But it also unevenly then began to play a role in different towns and different areas of Luhansk and Donetsk. And so it was a very diversified and complex scene. And so a single policy towards what was going on was not something that we immediately jumped onto. And why some of the voices of de-escalation, negotiation, relying on the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe to try to mediate, other kind of diplomatic methods to try to mediate were the initial instincts.
I recall at the time, it was unclear for a period of a couple months whether this was going to actually move out of the armed protests into an actual conflict, right?
Yes. I mean, that was the general view. Now, I will say that I was pretty certain that there was Russian influence behind this, and it seemed to me to be consistent with how Russia had for decades used the unresolved conflict in Transnistria and used unresolved conflicts in Abkhazia and South Ossetia in Georgia to move to gain influence and to sustain those unresolved conflicts in order to stop the Europeanization of Georgia on the one hand and Moldova in the other. And so when the first reports came to our attention at the NSC of the protests in Crimea, and then the first signs that actually there was regular Russian military forces moving in within days after Yanukovych had fled, my immediate assessment was that what the Kremlin is after here is to create an unresolved conflict on the territory of Ukraine, because the initial bet, which was to have influence over Yanukovych and rely upon Yanukovych to prevent Ukraine from becoming an EU member closer to the EU, the Kremlin had given up on, obviously, because he had failed, and they needed a new hook. And so it was in that context that I saw Russian operations in Crimea and the move to control Crimea. And then once we started seeing Russian elements as well as all of the local elements that Serhiy has documented, that the Russian operations were not about, sort of ancient beliefs that this region was really Russian, but it was about creating an unresolved conflict to make sure that Ukraine as a whole would be stuck in the same kind of unresolved conflict trap that had entrapped Moldova and Georgia for decades.
So that Russian influence ends up being crucial here. But essentially we see that the Russian-backed militants established control in some cities and others remained loyal to Kyiv. How do we explain that puzzling finding?
Yeah, so let me correct you a little bit. It's not that some of the towns remained loyal, so to speak, to Kyiv. It's that in some of the towns and major centers of agglomeration, for example, that time it was called Krasnoarmeysk, now it's called Pokrovsk. The agglomeration around Pokrovsk, for example, had no militant presence whatsoever, even though on the Ukrainian maps, this particular agglomeration was marked as if it was occupied by the Russian forces. So the nature of the relationship of the local actors to the Ukrainian government at that time was in flux. And when I interviewed a lot of local administrators from different towns, they said that basically the Ukrainian authorities, they were so overwhelmed with so many different challenges they had to face on domestic fronts and on external front that they really could not coordinate or contact the local administrators in some town in Donetsk or Luhansk Oblast. They did not have time for that. And they did not really delegate individuals who would be speaking and coordinating their actions on behalf of the Ukrainian government. So many of them, I remember one of the officials used this phrase, we feel like a kitten, like kittens which were left by our cat that we were used to being together. So I think that goes, maybe I'm jumping ahead here, about the lessons of this insurgency. That, I think, contributed to the sense that the entire region is, so to speak, in some ways, is no longer part of Ukraine. Now, when it comes to the actual variation, I think the variation was in the extent to which the local militants, the armed insurgents that actually emerged in a number of towns, and we know what these towns are, they're in the news today, unfortunately, Slovyansk, Kramatorsk, Drushkivka, Horlivka. In these towns, all of these armed insurgents and militants, as I document, all of the leading ones, all of the ones who are at the top of the hierarchy, are coming from Russia. And the smoking gun, as far as the Russian role is concerned, for me personally, was when you examine day by day, week by week, the variation of administrative control and militant presence of the insurgents across the region. You clearly see a correlation between the distance to these centers of militant control, like Slovyansk and Horlivka, and, on the other hand, the extent to which these towns are fully or partially or under no control of the militants themselves. So what it told me when I completed my analysis was that without the Russian component, the protest movement that was genuine, was grassroots, lots of people there were unhappy with the new Ukrainian authorities, with the Euromaidan revolution, we know all of that. But that movement would never have acquired this characteristics of an armed insurgency if we did not have these professional agents from Russia who were trained and had numerous experiences in different regions, including Georgia and Chechnya, of organizing these types of armed challenges to the state. So that is, I think, is the decisive evidence, in my view, of why Russia ultimately is responsible for the start of the insurgency. Now, some question whether or not, for example, Girkin or a number of other individuals mentioned in the book are government officials that represent Putin. And here, of course, now especially with the history of Prigozhin and the history of these paramilitary groups that are indirectly linked to the state, that have these shadow contacts to the state, we know that this is how the Russian state operates in the areas where it does not want to recognize its presence. So even though Girkin might not have been a direct agent of Putin and did not receive orders from specific headquarters in Moscow, but certainly through various shadow links, and we know what these links are. We know his connection to these financial actors in Moscow, for example, who funded him, for whom he worked, Malafeyev. These individuals who were linked to Kremlin certainly controlled and provided some kinds of reassurances to Girkin himself. And so in that sense, I think it's completely legitimate and acceptable to view them as agents of the Russian state as well.
So, Celeste, that seems to fit with what you were saying, that the Russian hand was pretty evident even early on.
Yeah, completely does. And I agree. I think that as we were watching the protests in different towns, it was quite difficult to see a pattern in where they emerged and where they became broader and more entrenched and more successful in taking town halls or centers of administrative guidance of villages. And it really was very patchwork, where the protests succeeded, where they remained peaceful, where they got momentum. But I think that, as Serhiy says, it's clear that the actual coercive nature of the protests and their ability to have staying power was related to the pattern of where there were Russian individuals from Russia, many of whom had been to the regions before.
So you touched a bit on geography, and it ends up being really important here. The Donbas is heavily populated, industrialized region, and some of this contestation here is taking place in cities. So how does this how does the urban nature of the environment affect militants' ability to take over towns and the Ukrainian government's ability to reestablish control?
Another dynamic that's important to understand is, Ukraine did not have military forces in eastern Ukraine. All of Ukraine's military, training ranges, basically supply depots, bases, were in western Ukraine because they were built in the Soviet period and they were there for a war with NATO. And so much of the Ukrainian armed forces, army forces in particular, but also air forces, were based in western Ukraine. And so to the extent that there was a armed part of the official Ukrainian response to taking buildings, protests, it was either local police forces or it was Interior Ministry forces, which began to move to the east, especially after the experience of Crimea and the inability of Kyiv, central authorities in Kyiv, to get defense forces into Crimea. There was, it's a peninsula, and it's a peninsula with a very, very narrow isthmus, so it just wasn't going to happen. And so to the extent you had forces there, they were Interior Ministry forces. Ukraine's Interior Ministry forces are very capable, very professional, well-equipped for their mission, but their mission is not to fight in urban conflict. It's not to fight street to street. It's not to do those kinds of operations. It is essentially a police force. It's an enhanced police force, but and I mean this in a positive way, but the kind of large formations of armor, any kind of air support, any kind of intelligence, reconnaissance that you would normally bring to bear in the kind of combat that began to develop in those urban environments was not something that the Interior Ministry had. They kind of developed it on the fly, and eventually, as some of the regular Ukrainian army forces began to be moved to the east, it changed to some extent. But I think early on, that was part of the reason why some of those Russian enhanced armed insurgent forces were able to have the successes in those urban environments that they did. And you saw actually the police forces and the interior forces having much more success around villages and towns, regaining control of roads. That was kind of more, in their training and in how they were equipped.
I fully agreed with Celeste in her analysis of the state of Ukrainian armed forces. But I want to add a couple of more points. So first of all, when we think about the initial phase of the insurgency, that is April, May of 2014, even June, it is important to recognize that the number of militants in each town was minuscule, especially compared to the general population of the region of Donbas. We're talking about initially several hundred people, then we're talking about several thousand people. By the Ukrainian estimates, and I give Ukrainian estimates of the Ukrainian armed forces, in July of 2014, the total withdrawal from Slovyansk agglomeration, they had about 4,000 militants who withdrew from that agglomeration. But that agglomeration was over 300,000 people altogether. It's a huge agglomeration of 5 different cities, for which, by the way, the Russian armed forces have been fighting for the last 3 years. So I think it is natural to ask this question. So if the number of militants was so small, and these towns where they operated were such a significant, sizable towns with major industrial production, huge factories, why was there no pushback from within these communities? Because yes, you don't have armed forces who are capable of doing counterinsurgency operation right away. But if you're dealing with a few hundred people at the beginning and you see them as your enemy, I think it's possible to imagine in any American town of this size, when you have people who just show up and say, we are the government now, it's easy to imagine there will be self-defense mobilization. I live in Texas right now, so I certainly can imagine this scenario in Texas very easily.
I hear you there, that's for sure.
So I think that is the question that I also was seeking to answer in my book. And the answer to this question cannot be just simplified as people supported them, right? Because we understand that the people at that time were very much disoriented. And even if there was no direct opposition to these individuals and these militants, there certainly was a neutral stance that the majority was taking because they viewed the Ukrainian authorities at that time, who just came to the government of Arseniy Yatsenyuk, acting president Alexander Turchynov. We all remember there is no democratically elected president. He fled. So there has to be a new presidential election campaign. And they're viewing these authorities as not entirely legitimate from their standpoint and potentially threatening to them, because on top of that, you have the Russian disinformation campaign in multiple media outlets that are basically telling that this new government that is filled with these Ukrainian nationalists are about to come over and get you and kill you, all of you. And so this self-defense mobilization, remember, they're presenting themselves as self-defense forces. They're using this, in a way, borrowing the label that the Maidan people were using against the Yanukovych government. They're viewed by the local population as a genuine response to the threat that is coming from Kyiv. And in that sense, there is a lot of confusion happening on how to interpret those people who are there. They're not necessarily viewed as Russian. There is a famous video of the capture of Slovyansk police station, so the first really armed takeover of a local police station by Girkin people. They're all wearing masks, and there is a city mayor who is standing next to them on the barricades a few hours later, and she's just telling the locals, "Don't worry, these are our guys. Это наши ребята. These are our guys." She has no idea who is behind the masks, but she makes this assumption. So in the atmosphere of this total informational confusion and people unsure about how to interpret what is happening around them, it is easy to manipulate the public opinion to an extent where even foreigners with a completely foreign agenda to the region, with no prior connections — Girkin never visited the region before he showed up in Slovyansk — would be viewed as potentially defenders and, if not support, then at least a neutral response. So that is one caveat here regarding the local population's view. But also, I want to emphasize the extent to which the Ukrainian armed forces were not ready to deal with this challenge. And I remember there's numerous memoirs of Ukrainian soldiers and special operation officers from this time. And there is one book in which you have an interview with a special operation officer from Kramatorsk. In Kramatorsk, there was a military airport where the Ukrainian armed forces were controlling this airport for the entire duration of the conflict. So even though the city itself of Kramatorsk was controlled by the militants, our airport on the outskirts of the city was in fact fully controlled by the Ukrainian army. And there was this tension there. And this special operations officer said in an interview that we were asking Kyiv to give us a go-ahead to take down all these militants in the city, because we knew through the informers — there were multiple informers, people who sided with Ukraine, who provided them with information, material support, etc. And they were telling them one by one, a whole list of all the militants, like we knew them by name. If there was a go-ahead from Kyiv to do that, we had sufficient number of people to quickly deal with these guys. And so the same is true in Mariupol. The same is true in a number of other towns where the Ukrainian authorities were reluctant to use force, primarily because what Celeste discussed in the context of Maidan, there was this fear that if they use force, they will be accused of the same things that they accused Yanukovych of, and that would produce local backlash, and even more people would join the side of the militants. So that period of uncertainty and reluctance also allowed the militants to consolidate their control over this region.
I wanted to just quickly observe one more reason why those large numbers of Ukrainians in eastern Ukrainian towns didn't, push out or protest or oppose handfuls of protesters, of operatives. And that is, the experience of what had happened in Crimea was pretty well known, where when there was pushback, when there was opposition, when there were some acts of heroism, Ukrainian naval forces — there weren't a lot, there was a lot of signing on and loyalty oaths to the Russian Navy and turning sides, but there were instances of soldiers, and there were instances, for example, of Crimean Tatars protesting and seeking to not, go along with what was going on in Sevastopol, Simferopol, and other locations in Crimea. There were many instances of murders, of brutality, I remember reports of, bodies being found in ditches. And you don't, unfortunately, and in a situation like that, you don't have to kill an awful lot of people to send a message that protest in that context is pretty dangerous. And it is a different dynamic in Crimea. I recognize that because it was unacknowledged, but regular Russian military forces doing that. But there were those reports, and I don't know for a fact if they got to eastern Ukraine, but I know that because we were getting them at the White House from the Ukrainian government, and they were being confirmed by journalists who had gotten into Crimea. And so I think that just adds to that atmosphere of it's not clear what you do. And what the Kremlin ended up doing was taking advantage of that lack of clarity. And it was by taking advantage of that confusion, that kind of, well, they're protesters, we're not sure, shouldn't use violence against them. Gosh, do we really want regular army forces to be going after civilians in towns? Not sure that's a good idea. And unfortunately, the Kremlin is not constrained by such niceties when it decides what it's going to do.
This is a fascinating conversation to me because for the irregular warfare professionals that listen to this podcast, in some ways, what you're describing is almost like an astoundingly successful unconventional warfare campaign, right? Where a relatively small number of militants with like these special operator, covert instigators essentially were able to create this resistance that made a bunch of people in the Ukrainian public that weren't even all that enthusiastic about them sort of switch sides or have those territory come under their control. But then on the other hand, I'm listening to this and I'm hearing a lot of like pretty unique conditions that may not be applicable to other conflicts or countries, like the fact that Kyiv was kind of holding back because of the unique context. So help me think through a bit, if we can, about what we can learn from this case, perhaps more generally about what makes states more or less resilient to armed resistance.
So I think the initial stage of the capture of power in a number of major cities in Donbas was not sufficient for these militants to ultimately establish control over the entire region. In fact, what they lacked was the administrative capacity, administrative skill, administrative capability to start ruling these towns. So it's one thing to claim, I am the new Tsar here, as Girkin said when he captured the town, the city of Slovyansk, but then actually to know how to run, provide water to people, how to run the, public transportation, how to organize normal life. These details and specifics is unclear to people who come from Russia. And so when they are faced suddenly with these challenges, and by the way, speaking about the counterinsurgency element to the story, the way in which Ukrainian government responded was not just by deploying troops around Slovyansk, but by using a couple of political and economic levers in adding pressure on these regions. And one of these levers was cutting financial transfers to all of the towns that were controlled by the militants. So all of these towns, people who went to the factories, many of them were receiving funds from the government because they were working, even though these private factories working on state orders, etc. They could not receive their money anymore. Banks were removed from these towns. They could not receive money from the ATM machines. Teachers and all of the public sector were not receiving money. So these elements of these levers were quite effective, I think, in especially May and then June, when these militants very quickly, remember, proclaimed these two separatist republics of Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republic, so-called, after this fake referendum that they held. And they were effective because they demonstrated to the locals that it's one thing to have someone in charge with a machine gun, and it's quite another to have someone who is capable of organizing their life in their town. If we're thinking about the lessons of this insurgency, it is, I think, that even without the coercive element, the Ukrainian government could have broken this separatist campaign had there been an initial effort on the part of the Ukrainian authorities to work with the local administrators to prevent their defection to the side of the separatists. Because unfortunately, the way in which this insurgency unfolded was, yes, they initially seized a number of towns and removed the coercive presence of the Ukrainian state. That is what I call the state founding stage. But then there is a state building stage. You proclaim a separatist republic, so start governing. And in that state building stage, the Ukrainian authorities had to move in and work with the local governments to make sure that they do not collaborate with the insurgents, reassure them through multiple ways that this is a temporary state of affairs and that together they would be able to squeeze these militants out of these towns. Unfortunately, from everything I learned doing interviews, that did not happen. And in fact, many of these administrators, exactly because they did not receive clear instructions from Kyiv, and we understand how hierarchical Ukrainian administrative system was. It's not like even close to a federal system. In fact, especially Donbas was very much a hierarchical structure where all the orders coming from Kyiv were fulfilled by the lowest official on the village level, right? So having this connection to central government was extremely important for these local officials. When they were suddenly cut off from any contacts and they could not really coordinate their actions together across multiple towns in Donbas, that is when the second weakness of the state emerged, that these militants exploited, right? I think when the Ukrainian government was thinking through the ways in which they could respond, they primarily focused on these pressure points, and they did not think about how locally their efforts would be presented, and they could not find the partners among the local authorities, did not try to find partners among local authorities who would be helping them in this counterinsurgency effort.
Serhiy is absolutely expert and that resonates. And I do remember, it wasn't our decision, but I do remember something of there was a difference of views about whether it was wise of the Kyiv authorities to cut off a certain town. So I do remember that discussion. I think it's a really terrific insight. I think it goes to a deeper point. I'm not sure how this fits into a lessons learned for counterinsurgency, but Donetsk and Luhansk had been so alienated from politics in other parts of Ukraine for such a long time, and there had been such a political divide that had played out in elections for, quite a period of time. And, I wonder if the fact that Yanukovych and that faction of the Ukrainian leadership had been in control for all those years reinforced that top-down structure, which was, I don't know if it was present across all of Ukraine, where you had, because one of the things I'm always had always been struck by was, in contrast to Russia, which is, you look at a map and you look at the organizational structure, the administrative structure, and this is a federation. Of course, it's not. Whereas in Ukraine, regionalism really did matter in terms of the feel of politics, local elections. And I wonder if that vertical nature that was not necessarily foreordained, but had been reinforced because the Party of Regions, that was its way of doing business, that was baked into the dynamic that you identify.
And just for any of the listeners that don't know, the Party of Regions was Yanukovych's party and was a major center of political power in eastern Ukraine.
Right. That is absolutely correct. And that I want to emphasize. That was not just an administrative structure, the way the Ukrainian state was functioning, but this was a political dimension. That is the fact that the Party of Regions used Donbas as its basically electoral fiefdom, political fiefdom, economic fiefdom. That's where they would get all their money and revenues. And as a result, starting basically from early 2000s, that's when Party of Regions was organized, around late 1990s, early 2000s. From then onwards, they made sure that no local official, no city mayor would be unaffiliated with the Party of Regions. So it was just a total one-party state within state. Within Ukraine. There was only one city mayor in Luhansk who was not a member of the Party of Regions. And I met him, and probably not surprisingly, in that particular town, he organized the self-defense groups in support of Ukraine against the militants. Because he said, I was outsider, I was not part of their club, Party of Regions club, so I never would receive any orders from them. And so when Party of Regions collapses as a political party, and it was extremely powerful organization that sort of peaked at around the Yanukovych presidency. And when it suddenly implodes, you suddenly see that all of these local officials who were maybe part of this informal faction or the other, they are really not sure where to go because their patron has already left the country. And then there are these competing groups that are left on the ground of different Party of Regions wealthy donors and so on, who are maybe also giving them some signals, but it's all, for them, it's all confusing and it's unclear. And so as a result, the position of the Ukrainian government would have been decisive at that moment if there was any clear set of instructions coming from Kyiv to them, reassurance, etc. But unfortunately, in most cases, it did not happen. And for this reason, it made possible the holding of referendum, for example, of May 11th, 2014, this fake that sort of was imitated by the Crimean example, that allowed them to claim legitimacy behind their separatist project. There were attempts to disrupt the holding of this referendum in a number of towns, including, by the way, Pokrovsk. But these were local initiatives. Kolomoisky sent some people to Pokrovsk to prevent the holding of referendum. But in most other areas of Donbas, it actually took place.
I think it's really important to interject and fast forward to February 2022. I mean, there are many reasons for the Ukrainian defeat of the Russian invasion plan in February 2022. But what is very clear is a significant element that enabled Ukraine to fight off, in particular, the attempt to take Kyiv and to encircle Kyiv was local government, local and regional leaders organized average Ukrainians. I mean, there was a Ukrainian military, and they deserve, credit for a lot of their pre-planning and the training that they had undertaken. But if you really dig into some of the heroic stories of stopping Russian forces on the approaches into Kyiv, of thwarting the taking of, many towns and villages around, unfortunately, not enough because so many suffered. This is kind of grassroots, or it was organized by local mayors and regional leaders who had the courage, but also the legitimacy and, the ability to work with their communities. And so that kind of regionalism and that local politics provided a resilience in different parts of Kyiv that actually played a role in not a counterinsurgency, because by then you're a force on force national fight against invading national army. But I think you did see elements of the advantages of that kind of political culture and political organization that disaggregated and kind of local politics in the success of those first few weeks in February and March of 2022.
Why is it so different in 2022 versus 2014?
Well, first of all, because, there's broad awareness of how the Russians operate, a broad awareness of an identity of being Ukrainian as distinct and legitimate, not something that was as deliberately confused by not only Russian narratives, but also, narratives of some Ukrainian political figures, such as Yanukovych, but he was certainly not the only one. So there was a sense of national defense against those who were threatening that defense. So I think that we've already talked about how both the militants and the Russian agents, and then eventually, official Russian forces, took advantage of that ambiguity. There was a little bit of uncertainty about whether the American warnings of the invasion, were 100% certain to some extent. But once the invasion started, there was no ambiguity of what was going on here, that there was a Ukrainian nation being attacked by the Kremlin, by a Russian government that was back for more.
And I would add that what preceded 2022, so this period of consolidation of democratic institutions in Ukraine, the fact that we could hold presidential elections even though part of Ukraine was occupied, even though we were fighting the insurgency campaign, we still managed to hold free and fair elections and bring an opposition candidate to power, right? Remove an incumbent with an overwhelming support. These results, I think, demonstrated to the Ukrainian public, who had some maybe questions about whether democratic institutions work and operate and how, that in fact, the Ukrainian political process will deliver someone who would represent their interests if they trust Ukraine, if they believe in the Ukrainian state. And hence, this is something to fight for. This is a clear contrast to the type of regime that consolidated in Russia. Even though Zelensky's popularity was quite low at that time, remember, by 2022, prior to the invasion, he was hovering at like 30% approval. It was abysmal for a number of reasons. But because 70+% of Ukrainians voted for him, they still saw him as their president. So when he showed up on the first day and said, we're not leaving anywhere, this is the call from their democratically elected leader, the one that they voted for, majority of them voted for him, to stand up and resist. So I think the fact that you had this unambiguous result in 2019, that the elections were so successful, that you had this opposition candidate who becomes president, who is capable of communicating and mobilizing people, all of that contributes. And of course, a very different capacity of the state, a very different commitment and ability of the Ukrainian armed forces. All of that is important, but I think political factors should not be underestimated here.
This is fascinating because local politics ends up really mattering, but not in the way that people give it credit for. It seems like it's much more about institutions, about the presence of the state, about democratic legitimacy, and all of that seems to really matter in determining how people make choices about resistance and resilience. So I wanted to ask you both about the role of the United States and U.S. security cooperation with Ukraine in this time period. So first, for you, Celeste, what policy options was the United States considering when looking to respond to Russia's aggression in the Donbas?
So I had been Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense during the first Obama term, and so one of my tasks was to work on defense cooperation and working with the Ukrainian military, in particular to bring the Ukrainian military up to modern European standards. But it was an uneven process because, this is a theme, it depended on leadership. And the leadership of the Ukrainian Navy was very open to NATO partnership, had trained for partnership operations, anti-piracy operations, and so welcomed the opportunity for investment in building Ukrainian naval capability. I got to visit Sevastopol and visit the Ukrainian base and see the partnership and the training. The Air Force and the Army had different leaderships with different attitudes. They weren't necessarily, I think it's too simplistic to say they were pro-Russian. They were mostly complacent and not, particularly energized about enhancing capabilities and, transforming institutionally and also, in terms of forces and command and training. And so one of the challenges was the part of the Ukrainian military that the United States had the best relationships with and the relationships of trust. The Navy was immediately out of the fight because, of the Russian taking of Sevastopol and taking over of the Ukrainian base there. And we did not, the U.S. military had, formal relations. Our defense attaché office had relationships with the Army and the Air Force, but these were not relationships of trust, of training. And so we didn't have a base to work from. And I think that's important. And I don't say that to make excuses, but to point to the contrast to 2022, when there had been those relationships where there had been training, strong training since 2015, and where, including not just unit training, but also training in the operation and employment of course, the famous Javelin anti-tank weapons, which again proved so important in February of 2022. So it became not particularly useful discussion about which weapon system here, which weapon system there could you give the Ukrainian military. But most of those systems, require training in order to be able to operate them effectively. And meanwhile, facts on the ground were moving so quickly that you just didn't have the kind of time to figure out what you could ship and what you could send. So we provided counter battery radars. We provided some, supporting capabilities, uniforms, helmets, medical kits, that kind of capabilities, tents, that sort of stuff, but not really, main weapon systems. And there was a debate about javelins, but one of the challenges with that debate was it was hard to make a case that they would be decisive and change the fight at any given moment. And by the time it was clear that javelins were exactly what the Ukrainians could use, it was really 2015. It was the Battle of Debaltseve. And already, the Ukrainian military was operating at a huge disadvantage because by then you had again, unacknowledged, but very large numbers of regular Russian military forces in the country. And there was still a narrative, there were voices. I don't think it helps to blame or to name and shame, but there were voices arguing that we should provide what military capabilities we could and train the Ukrainian military as quickly as we could. But there was still an argument, and including coming from Europe, that's counter to the Minsk process, right? We've got these two Minsk agreements from September of 2014. And then following getting this to stop the fighting in Debaltseve, now we've got a Minsk 2, because Minsk 1 was, not particularly successful. And there, was a narrative of, well, we don't want to provoke a further fighting. We're supposed to be supporting a ceasefire. And there was a lack of imagination and understanding that in order to have a successful ceasefire and a successful negotiation, you really need to help the party you're supporting be resilient militarily, and the adversary has to see that continuing the fighting would be costly. And that part of the argument was missing from talking about arming Ukraine in 2014 and 2015. It was not absent in 2022, of course, to state the obvious, but that, I think, was one of the decisive differences.
Looking back on it now, was this 2014-2015 period a missed opportunity?
I think it morally would have been the right thing to provide, what weapons we could to Ukraine, but I don't think it would have changed the outcome. And I don't think we had the time, the scale, and again, the relationships to have made them effective in the fight. And, I say that based on what we were able to do in 2022, 2023, and 2024, when we were building on a foundation. We had the scale and the support from Europe could make the kind of difference that allowed Ukrainian forces to drive the Russian force out of Kharkiv, away from Odessa, out of Kherson. And that was a incredibly extensive, deep, and well-financed operation. I mean, in 2014 and 2015, I guess maybe if we'd gone to Congress, they would have given us $65 billion to send that amount of equipment to Ukraine, which is what we did in 2022, 2023, and 2024. I'm not sure. I mean, the practical logistics on the American side, it wasn't lined up. And again, that's not to make excuses, but it's to help understand that by late 2014, the Ukrainians were fighting the Russian army. And you kind of don't do that on the fly. That's not a counterinsurgency operation that, requires training, equipping, and sustaining a regular armed force, including a substantial army with armor, artillery, and air support. That's a pretty big undertaking.
Let me jump in here, because this is a discussion that generates a lot of emotions in Ukraine. The role of the United States and the fact that the United States did not provide us with arms up until basically Trump comes to power. And that's when the first presidency of Trump, that's when we received javelins. So let me say that Ukrainian discussion is based, of course, on the Budapest Memorandum. It starts with an argument that the United States obligated itself by signing the Budapest Memorandum to provide assistance to Ukraine in the case when it is threatened, not just economic or diplomatic, but also military assistance. That is the view. I'm not saying that this is what I share this view, but this is certainly the position of a lot of Ukrainians that would address this topic. First of all, I have to say that I'm currently working on a new book project that deals with the diplomatic history of the relations between Ukraine and the West. And I've been working in the archives and saw a lot of documents discussing what types of guarantees or promises Americans, the Brits, the Germans were willing to give Ukrainians. And all of these documents suggest that it was very clearly communicated to the Ukrainians at that time that no military assistance is part of the deal, that they should not count in any way on the fact that the United States or any other Western power that is part of this agreement will be stepping in case they're attacked by Russia or any other foreign power. And that has been the issue of contention during negotiations. This is the reason why ultimately it took so long for the Ukraine to agree to the transfer of nuclear weapons and their surrender. But this is the condition on which they gave it up. So I think the criticisms that are coming from the Ukrainians, and here I will generate a lot of attacks on myself, are unfair. Now, in defense of the Obama administration, and again, this is not a mainstream opinion in Ukraine here, but in addition to what Celeste just laid out, I have to say that from the very beginning, rightly or wrongly, the Obama administration accepted the Minsk framing, the Minsk process. The whole framing of this peace process was centered on resolving the internal conflict within Ukraine. In other words, it was about bringing several sides that represent these separatist republics and the Ukrainian government to the table and making them sign some types of agreements where they would agree on how they will move forward and regulate their relationship. That was the assumption on which all of the European powers and the United States approached that, even though publicly they were all talking about Russian interference. That's where I think you see this contrast or paradox. And if we view it from the political diplomatically as an internal conflict that has to be solved within Ukraine, any amount of external influx of arms coming from the United States into Ukraine will immediately generate a Russian response and say, okay, well, now we are going to send them officially, formally, all of these brothers and sisters in Donbas. We will not just provide covert support, but we will actually provide them with formal transfers of arms. And the higher you get the Americans in terms of the advanced equipment, the more advanced we will be providing them, the types of arms we will be giving. I think that was the calculation also, that there can be an arms race that any type of military assistance coming from the United States could provoke between Russia and the United States. And final point, this is what I read again in the Ukrainian Armed Forces official reports on 2014. This is called a white paper. Anyone can read it. And it basically says that after they broke through and the actual Russian armed forces were deployed in Donbas, the Ukrainian forces were so weak that if Putin gave order for these Russian armed forces to start moving outside of Donbas, they basically would have faced little resistance all the way to Kyiv. So from this standpoint, the risks associated with escalation back in 2014 were much higher for the Americans than they were in 2022. The capacity of Ukrainian armed forces to resist possible high escalatory response from Russians were much better. They were in much better shape in 2022. In 2014, Putin basically a clear cursive advantage there.
This is a great place to pivot to closing statements. What would you want scholars and practitioners to take away from this conversation that we've had today?
Well, three things. First, read Serhiy's book, Implication number 1. Implication number 2 is when these kinds of crises of resistance, protests, even low-level violence break out, you're not going to get clarity in the moment. It's going to be contradictory, confusing, multiple dimensions, conflicting intelligence reports, conflicting diplomatic reports. And in my experience, what can guide you through that is to have done the homework beforehand, to understand the politics, to understand organizational culture within the partner countries or adversary countries you're facing, to understand how their militaries operate, to look at the history of, when in that particular country or region, individuals have been willing to take up arms or have declined to take up arms. You have to have a context, a knowledge of previous cases, of history, and broad history, comparative history, but also specific to the countries, regions, leaders, and societies that you're looking at. Because there are patterns, but they'll still respond in different ways that really shape the kinds of policies that you need to consider, adopt, and implement to achieve objectives. And the third, again, is really highlighted in Serhiy's book, is that, so many actors have agency. You're highlighting how, individual militants did in individual towns, and that differed. Different commanders in different military units, whether that's formal military units or insurgency units, have different histories. They've learned different lessons. They have agency on how they're going to operate, who their relationships are with. So again, have a curiosity and an openness of mind to recognize that you need to have pre-existing understanding and patterns, but you need to be willing to understand that there could be new variables and new dynamics, because these crises are being driven by human beings, and human beings can be very unpredictable in ways that create opportunities as well as the challenges that we've described that we faced and that Ukraine faced in 2014 and 2015.
Yes, well, I cannot put it better than Celeste. I agree with her on all the points, including number one. But let me just add my own points here. One is about the role of civil society. And that was one of the biggest surprises for me as I was doing research, that in fact, so many people whom you would not imagine from in local communities who would suddenly be willing to engage in heroic, really, resistance when they were faced with huge dangers for the sake of the state. These people are the ones who are your allies. And when you are deploying troops, they're not operating in a vacuum. They're operating within the communities, many of whom, even though majority may not necessarily be either sympathetic or openly supportive of you, but you would have enough of the allies among these communities to draw on in order to make real changes. And so in those towns, we didn't really get to that discussion, but in those towns like Dobropilya, for example, that is now surrounded by the Russian troops, it was the initiative of these local community members who were IT specialists before, or who were local teachers or businessmen, etc., to get together and start building some kind of a self-defense group to show the Ukrainian presence, even though there is no state presence in the sense of police, etc. And through their contacts initiative, they were communicating with the Ukrainian military, who then provided them with some initial support. So civil society and reliance on these allies among community members, even the most surprising ones, would be a huge asset in these types of operations. And the second thing is when maybe the archives open for 2014, I'm not sure whether they'll still be around, but if they open sooner and I can still see them, what I'll be interested to see is whether prior to 2014 there have been any operational plans, both on the Western side and on the Ukrainian government side, for the kind of eventuality, for the kind of events that actually happened in Donbas. Because they were not utterly unimaginable. In fact, what I find in my current research in the archives in 1990s is that many diplomats at that time identified Donbas and the possibility of some kind of Russian subversion operations in Donbas as something that can happen in the nearest future. And that was one of the biggest surprises for me, is that already in the 1990s, it was viewed as a possibly potentially problematic area. And so as we get closer to 2014, it feels like the way in which the events developed, it feels like the Ukrainian government, the Ukrainian special services, etc., they did not have plans in place that would allow them to take more or less concerted action in response to the kind of challenges they face. And certainly it did not seem that way given the response of the Western governments as well. So I think having some kind of a more detailed planning to deal with these types of maybe very rare and surprising events, but that are still within the realm of the plausible, is something very important for the officials to have.
Thank you both so much for joining us. I really enjoyed this conversation.
Thank you for inviting us.
Thank you, Alex.
Thanks again for listening to this episode of the Irregular Warfare Podcast. If you like the show, please spread the word and consider sharing this episode with others. You can subscribe to the Irregular Warfare Podcast so you do not miss an episode. You can also engage with us on X, YouTube, Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram, and across many other platforms. If you found value in today's conversation, please leave us a review on Apple Podcasts. It really helps us reach new audiences. Support for the Irregular Warfare Podcast comes from members of the IW community like you, and from Hadean, an AI company focused on synthetic environments for training, planning, and decision support. And one last thing. What you heard in this episode are the views of the participants and do not represent those of West Point, Princeton University, the Irregular Warfare Initiative, or any agency of the U.S. or any other government. Thanks again for being part of this community, and we'll see you next time.